I'm Dr. Davo, and in the next two-part series, we're going to be looking at Psalm 23. In this first part, I'll be looking at the background aspects of the psalm and going through verse by verse, the first three verses. And let's trust God to come through for our lives. The psalmist writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." I want to use this first verse to sort of set up the background for this psalm. David is writing a personal psalm of trust. And when Israel read this psalm or sung this song, they had an understanding that this was a trust song and it had a particular structure. And what I want you to see is this particular structure where the Lord is my shepherd and the Lord shepherds me. It begins with Yahweh. Yahweh shepherds me is how the passage reads. And in verse 6, it's I will dwell in the house of Yahweh. So we have a framing or an inclusio of this psalm, the beginning and the end, that's focused on the shepherd Yahweh. It's not so much focused on the sheep as much as in the shepherd. So we'd have to understand what a shepherd is and that perspective of a sheep and looking to the shepherd. So many of us have a perspective of God that is mixed with our own perspective of our parents, or maybe a pastor we know, or we have incomplete idea of who God is. The scriptures are our defining understanding of who God is. And we have in this psalm, David is saying, is revealed to that God is the one who shepherds. A good shepherd will take the sheep on a journey to get refreshment of water, food, and protection. A shepherd would have to have different tools or elements in order to protect the sheep. A slingshot, a crook or a staff, a club or a rod. But the shepherd in David's time was left to either a family member, David was the youngest and he was assigned that task, or a local village would hire or assign a shepherd to take care of the flocks. If someone had a flock or several flocks, it was a sign of wealth. You could produce clothing from the wool, you could have meat, and you also had animals to sacrifice. So that shepherding was a very important position. It was also a very dangerous one. There were wild animals like hyenas or jackals, lions, and bears. So when David writes, "The Lord shepherds me," he's drawing on a context in Israel's history that's very important to Israel. In fact, in Isaiah 40 verse 11, it says, "Yahweh tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart, and he gently leads those who have young." In Isaiah 49:10, it says, "They will not be hungry or thirsty. The desert sun will not beat on them. He who has compassion on them will lead them beside springs of water." So when David introduces in this psalm, "The Lord shepherds me," he is emphasizing a shepherd that is successful in leading the sheep to meet their needs. It says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters." In verse 2, this is very important. Now, sheep didn't like the rocks. They didn't like the mountains. They liked the valleys. Sheep were easily startled. The shepherd is going to guide the sheep. And in this journey, it's the shepherd that causes them to lie down. And where they lie down is in green pastures. After a rain and the grass is nourished, the green grass shows at the tips and the ends. There's this idea of the green showing in the pasture. David is emphasizing that Yahweh, our God, makes us lie down in green pastures. And where he leads, this process of leading, is still waters, quiet waters. And David is emphasizing a shepherd himself, that a good shepherd brings the sheep beside refreshing waters where they can drink without fear. There's something implied here about the character of our God. He is a God who protects. If he brings us to green pastures and quiet waters, and he's standing there, he is protecting us and nourishing us. Not only does he lead us beside quiet waters, but he restores my soul. Verse 3 begins with him restoring my soul. This verse return is important. It's used in verse 6 as well. But here in verse 3, 3, he returns to be my soul. It reminds me of maybe being in a recliner next to a refrigerator. God is not only providing my physical needs, but he's also restoring my emotional heart. He returns to me, my soul. The verse continues, he guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. This idea of paths is the idea of those ruts. We lived in Texas for some time, and there would be certain paths that the coyotes or the wolves would walk, or certain animals. It'd be a thin path, but you could tell where the animals would continually walk. It was familiar to them. It was a path that they could follow. It's this idea, very similar to the Old West with the wagon wheels. Our shepherd leads us in paths, in ruts, in places that are easy for us and familiar. Here we have the idea of righteousness that's used. It's an important theological term in the Old Testament. For us as Christians, it's the covering and the blood shed for us that Jesus, when God looks at us, because of the blood, God sees righteousness and purity, and we stand in that righteousness. When David's writing on behalf of Israel, it was the law and the covenant and the obedience to the covenant and the sacrificial animals that were sacrificed that covered Israel while God was present with them in the temple or the tabernacle. David is saying that this shepherd guides you and covers you in paths of righteousness, and it's for his name's sake. This idea of name emphasizes possession. In the Old Testament, Israel was God's possession. But Peter in the New Testament says, you are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood and a holy nation, people of his own. You are called out of darkness into marvelous light. We've looked at verses 1 through 3. And what's important, and I want you to enter in with prayer before we get to part 2, is say, Lord, I want your provision. I want your protection. I want to trust you, and I need to sense your presence.